Let's get into this. All right, welcome everybody. So appreciate your taking the time to join us this evening. I hope the information we're going to present to you is helpful. Before we dive in, just a couple quick logistical things. The first one is we are recording this. We're going to cover a lot of ground tonight in a relatively short amount of time. We'll try to get the link to the recording out to you tomorrow or on Wednesday. So please don't feel like you have to hang on our every word tonight. Obviously, we'll feel flattered if you do, but the real goal tonight is just at a high level, kind of as the title suggests, just so you have a little bit of context in terms of what the standardized testing landscape looks like now, and a little bit of context in terms of how colleges are using these tests. Also, feel free to share the link to the recording if you have friends or colleagues who you think might be interested. Definitely feel free to share the link with them. Also, if you have any questions, please don't hold back. Please just type those questions in the Q&A tab that you should see on your screen. Just in the interest of time, we're going to hold questions to the end, but we'll keep an eye on the time, keep us moving tonight, and then Jed and I will circle back and answer any questions that you have. All right, in terms of who we are, I'm Drew Heilpern from Summit Educational Group. I've been in this field now since 2010. So going on like 16 years. And again, appreciate everyone joining tonight. Adam, unfortunately, is not feeling well at all. So he is fine, but he's on bed rest this evening. So it will be the Jed and me show. Jed, you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yes, Jed Applerouth, founder of Applerouth Tutoring Services, and been doing this for quite a while, like Drew. And we are nerds about testing. We're all into it. We've been tracking the changes for, a quarter century, all the ups and downs and how it evolves. So we're very happy to share what we know and hopefully answer all the questions you came here with tonight.
All right, perfect. All right, at a high level in terms of what we're going to cover tonight, we're just going to run you through the college admissions testing landscape, just focus in kind of what it looks like now and some of the changes that we have seen. We'll talk about the SAT and the ACT, the differences between them, just so you have a better understanding of what these tests look like and some of the nuances behind them. We'll definitely talk about a testing plan. We'll give you some guidelines, some things to think about as you're thinking about your students' standardized testing plan. Jed will talk a little bit about why test scores still matter and kind of how colleges are using these scores now. Also touch on how strong scores can still help your student, especially at some of the more selective and most competitive schools, even though we do still find ourselves in this test optional environment, which we'll walk you through in a little bit more detail in a minute. And then just thinking about your path going forward in terms of, again, back to that plan, kind of good next steps and what to do from here. All right, so with that as a quick intro, Jed, I will kick it over to you.
Fabulous. All right, thank you, Drew. So the first section is looking at what's changed recently, because if you have been tracking it, things are in the move. Things have been changing quite a bit, especially the past 3 or so years. And there's really a swinging back towards test required and tests having more weight than they did during the COVID times. Next slide, Drew. So first, you have to understand the world we live in. We live predominantly in a test optional world. There are about 2,500 four-year colleges, depending on how you cut it, and under 100 of them are test required. However, many of these that are test required are the ones that you talk about or you're interested in. They're often part of the conversation nationally. So test optional is the vast majority of colleges, over 1,900 now, are test optional. So required is a small number. Optional is a much larger number, but optional doesn't mean that they're test blind. It's a very, very different thing. They're optional, but they can matter quite a big, a meaningful amount. So test blind, test free, that is a shrinking number of schools, and that number might shrink dramatically in the next 18 months because the UCs, they're pushing back hard. The faculty are not happy with this test blind admissions, and they're worried that the quality of applicants is really dropping and kids are coming into college. They can barely do middle school math and their writing skills are terrible. So the faculty is demanding test return. The tests will come back, and so they're going to evaluate this and make a ruling by the end of this academic year. That will leave Cal State, and I'm curious if UCs go, will Cal State follow? We'll see. But what's happening out in California is changing the national conversation. Then you have a small handful of schools that are test flexible. Yale actually dropped that about a month ago. So now it's NYU and Carnegie Mellon, where they'll take, in lieu of the SAT or ACT, they'll also take all of your APs or all of your ABs. But that's honestly almost on one hand or two hands. So the majority of schools out there are optional. You have about 50 or so critical ones that are required, and then you have mostly California where it's blind for like the two big state systems. All right, next, please. All right, so test optional. There was a minute, and I think that minute's passing, where it was probably 2003 and 4. I'm sorry, 2023, 24, post-pandemic, where optional, people thought, well, tests don't really matter. It's optional, but they didn't understand that there are many things in an application that are optional, but are very, very impactful. And it can make the difference between getting in and not getting in. So you have the choice, and there is a lane that students get in without test scores. But there are some schools where the majority of kids, and even the vast majority of kids getting in, have test scores. So you have to be mindful that optional means different things at different institutions. And so, for sure, when you send an application with, grades, recommendations, activities, that is a full application without testing. But there can be differential rates of admission for kids with testing and without. So you have to figure out, do I send my test scores? Will it help me? Will it hurt me? And it really varies at different schools. One of my best friends, his daughter is going to be applying, and she's all about Vanderbilt, like many people out there. And there's a whole discussion of, can we send the 33 or not? So we talk to people, and it's optional, but there's a whole thing of, can that score, if I send it, hurt me or help me? So there's definitely nuance in here with what does optional actually mean. Next slide. All right, so here we're looking at the growth of the SAT. And right now we're in a place where, for a time, the ACT was the #1 test. Drew and I were both in the space back in 2015, 16, where they looked so smart, they were doing everything right. But then, they were aligned with the Common Core. Back then with state standards, they were getting all these national contracts. Or, there were like 25 states that required the ACT. They were doing great, But then things began to shift. The ST came back. When the pandemic hit, they both cratered because kids couldn't get testing. It was COVID. You couldn't do anything. And so test scores, that's when the world went test required to test optional. And you had, suddenly an extra 800 schools are now test optional. But then the SAT had a nice rebound recovery. One change they made in 2023, 24, they went for a very short digital SAT, which Drew will discuss at length. The ACT didn't make that change, and they never fully recovered. And they had changes in leadership and ownership, and they were actually just purchased by ETS. There's a whole thing about that. But they're looking at retooling. They also shortened their tests, which Drew will discuss. But they're trying to get back in the game because they really haven't been able to get the traction back and the momentum going again like they had before the pandemic. All right. Next slide. And just globally, so about 2/3 of the students in the country are taking the SAT over the ACT. And that's what we see over at Summit in Applerouth. About 2/3 of our kids are prepping for the SAT. But the ACT, as Drew will discuss at length, is a very good test for many kids and is the one we prefer for certain kids. All right, so test return is growing, and I actually need to update the slide because many of you, heard Vanderbilt is now a test required for rising sophomores. So the juniors have a pass, but it's, little by little, we're seeing, more and more schools that are very desirable, very attractive, very selective, saying test scores are now required. They were optional, but now they're not. And that trend will continue. And if California goes test required from test blind, there's going to be a ripple effect in the whole industry. And I imagine we might pick up another 30, 40 schools going test required. If UC says we were blind, they don't matter at all. Actually, they matter a lot. That just it shifts the conversation. So you see the flagships, the big state schools, the elite private schools, the majority of elite engineering schools, the STEM schools, and then you have all the Ivies. So we don't have all of these on here, but there are more schools, and this list grows every couple of months, essentially. All right, next slide, please. All right, so California, I mentioned. This is honestly, it's a national conversation. It was in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. The New York Times editorial board got together and said, UC, bring back testing. This experiment has failed, and the president of the UC back when they went test blind, Jed Applerouth, called this essentially a failed experiment. And so the person who initiated this thing is saying this didn't work. And you have, I think it's 3,000 professors, and almost all of them, UC Berkeley, they're banging down the doors to bring it back. UC San Diego, because there's been a 24-fold increase in the number of kids who are coming to UC San Diego who are remedial in math. And so they're going into like calculus classes, and as teachers are saying, these kids can't do algebra. And it's causing problems in the classroom. And the teachers of English are saying these kids can't write sentences very well. And this is, that actually is from Berkeley. So a student gets into UC Berkeley and they can't write a sentence effectively. And that's one thing that, when you have test scores, they protect against rampant grade inflation, leading to kids getting in who are lacking in fundamental skills. So the SAT, you can't fake it. Your high school can have a very lax grading culture and then give away A's. But the SAT actually over time has been, it's not been inflated, actually the opposite. So UC Berkeley and San Diego, these guys really want testing back. And we'll see what happens if they bring back, they allow the 8 schools to choose, because maybe you don't need testing UC Riverside or UC Merced, but I think you need it to protect kids at San Diego and Berkeley and UCLA. So we'll see how it plays out. All right, next slide, please. All right, and we have here some information in terms of the percent of kids who submit tests and don't submit tests, to give you a sense of how much tests matter at schools, because there are definitely schools, even very strong schools, where these numbers are much, much lower, where test submission is down in the 30s, 40s. But here, and one thing we've seen over time is that typically when a school crosses 70% in terms of test submission, in most cases, within a couple of years, they go back test required. That might not happen at Duke or at Chicago, but I'm waiting, for UNC, Chapel Hill. I'm waiting for UVA and Emory to go back test required, and it could be this year or next year. So it's just giving you a sense that very often you see the preferences of an admissions office by who gets in, and are they letting in more kids with test scores or not? And at these elite schools, they seem to like test scores. All right, next slide. All right, Drew.
All right. So I'll just walk you through, thanks, Jed. I'll just walk you through just the SAT and the ACT, just to give you a little bit more color in terms of kind of what these tests look like now and some of the differences between them. I will say colleges do accept both tests equally. I know Jed showed that statistic where in terms of market share right now, more students are taking the SAT than the ACT, but all colleges in the US accept both tests equally. They do not have a preference for one test over the other. They don't see one test as a superior test and the other test as an inferior test. So really, at the end of the day, it's up to your student to decide, do I want to focus and go down an SAT path, or do I want to focus on the ACT and go down an ACT path? So as we dive into the standardized testing landscape, I do just want to take a minute just to talk about the PSAT. Many juniors and even some sophomores will take the PSAT. For our rising juniors, they will take it in October of their junior year. It's administered at their school. And a couple things about the PSAT. The first one is it really is just a practice test, though. Colleges don't see PSAT scores. They don't make any admission decisions based on PSAT scores. Anytime students get an opportunity to take a practice test under real conditions, especially when it doesn't really count for anything, it's always good practice and good helpful for students. For our juniors who take it, I do just want to mention it is called the PSAT NMSQT. So the NMSQT part, that's the National Merit Scholarship Program. So for high scoring students, it does make them eligible to become a National Merit Scholar, either a National Merit semifinalist or finalist. But just note, even though the PSAT, it has this, for our juniors, it has this scholarship element to it. It's an incredibly competitive scholarship. It's less than 1% of students nationally who are going to be named a National Merit semifinalist or finalist. Colleges aren't making any admission decisions based on whether a student was a National Merit semifinalist or finalist. The scholarship award, I always joke, it hasn't been adjusted for inflation since its inception. So it used to cover like full year of tuition, books, room and board, like all in. It's $2,500. Obviously, if your student gets the award, you will cash the check because every little bit helps. But again, if your student just misses the cutoff, It's not like they're out some like $90,000 scholarship. There are some schools out there. I'll talk about this in a minute that might increase their merit aid awards. I think Jed might get into this. So, again, for students who are national merit semifinalists or finalists, depending on the schools they ultimately enroll in, there might be a little bit more merit aid money for them. But I really want students to see this PSAT really just as a practice test. You get a baseline score, which is always helpful, but more importantly, students get the experience of actually taking or getting a preview of what taking that SAT is going to be like. The PSAT, it's the exact same length of test as the SAT. It's also the digital adaptive format, which I'll walk you through in a minute as well. So it totally mimics the test taking experience that students will see when they take the SAT. All right, let's just do a deeper dive in terms of what these tests now are. So one of the major changes that the SAT made coming out of COVID when they were trying to kind of reestablish market share and to encourage more students to actually take their standardized tests is one of their goals for their most recent redesign was to shorten the test. So the previous iteration of this test, it was a paper and pencil test. It was a 3-hour test. It was a bit of a slog for students. So one of the goals in this redesign when they moved to this digital adaptive format was to shorten the test, and they were able to do that. So here you can see it's now a 2-hour and 14-minute test. It's 2 sections of reading and writing. I'm just going to call that verbal, 32 minutes each. So 64 minutes on the verbal part, and then 2 sections on the math, 35 minutes each for a total of 70 minutes. It's still on that same 400 to 1600 point scale. So 200 to 800 in terms of its scoring on the verbal, 200 to 800 on the math. So even though it's moved to this adaptive scoring format, it's still the same scoring scale that kind of we all knew and love going back in the day, that same SAT that we took back in the day. The other nice feature that the digital SAT has is it has a built-in Desmos calculator that students have access to on every single math question that they're going to see. And I'll say on the PSAT, they also have access to this Desmos calculator. And for those of you familiar with Desmos, you know it is a very powerful graphing calculator tool. So if students have had some practice with it and some exposure to it, it can be very, very helpful in terms of answering some of the questions that they're going to see on this test. Having said that, students can absolutely bring in their own graphing calculator as well. So they can bring in their own TI-83 or TI-84 and use that in lieu of or in addition to that Desmos. And we'll talk about it in terms of the test planning a little bit later. But the SAT, it's offered multiple times throughout the year, so students are going to have many, many opportunities to take this test. But this is what the digital SAT now looks like. And as I mentioned, it's moved to this adaptive structure. So this is the way that the SAT was actually able to shorten their test. So to go from a 3-hour paper and pencil test to a 2-hour and 14-minute digital adaptive SAT. And I already mentioned this, but in terms of the structure of the test, there's 2 sections on the verbal and there's 2 sections on the math. I'm going to call them modules. So there's module 1 on the verbal, and then module 2 on the verbal, and then module 1 on the math, and then module 2 on the math. And I do just want to take a minute just to walk you through the adaptive scoring structure for the SAT, just so you have a better understanding in terms of how this works. And what we're looking at here is, think of this as being like a heat map of level of difficulty of questions, but in that first module, and this is true of both the verbal first module and the math first module, what students are going to get in that first module is they're going to get some easy questions, some middle level questions, some hard questions, some of the hardest questions on this test. And then depending on how well students do in that first module, they're going to get sent to one of 2 second modules. So let's say a student did quote well in that first module. And we think by doing well, it's answering about 60% of the questions correctly. So students don't have to be perfect on this. But for those students who have answered more than 60% of those questions, Based on that performance, what the test has figured out is that this student is somewhere in the 450 to 800 point range, but the test doesn't know where in the range that student is. So is this a 450, a 550, a 650, a 750, or an 800 level student? So to figure out exactly what that student score is in this harder module, as kind of the name implies, what students are going to get in this harder second module is they're going to get hard questions, harder questions, some of the hardest questions in this test to figure out where in that range that student is. Let's say a student struggled a little bit with that first module. Let's say they answered about 50% of the questions correctly. Again, once they've completed that first module, the test knows that that's how they've done. And based on that student's performance, the test has figured out that this student is somewhere in the 200 to low 600 point range. But again, it doesn't know where in that range that student is. So in this quote, easier second module, again, as the name implies, what students are going to get is they're going to get easy questions. It's going to be mostly middle level questions. There might be the occasional hard question or two to figure out where in that range that student is. Just note, if a student ends up in this easier second module, their score is going to be capped. So we think the highest score that they can get is somewhere in the 620 to 630 range. So there's nowhere to game this in terms of being like, oh, Drew, so what I'll do is I'll just intentionally miss some questions in the first module. So I go to the easier second module and then I answer all those questions correctly. There's no gaming this. Generally speaking, most students are going to obviously try to get into that harder second module. But it's important for students to know that when they've completed the first module, even though the test knows which second module they're sending the student to, the test is not going to tell them. So the test is not going to be like, hey, Drew, congrats, well done. You're in the harder second module. Or sorry, Drew, it didn't go so well. You're in the easier second module. And our general advice to students is to not waste any mental energy trying to guess which second module they are in. I'd much rather students just stay in the moment, focus on the questions in front of them, try to answer as many questions as they can correctly, because that's how they're going to optimize their score. Because you can see there is some overlap in scoring between these two modules in that 450 to low 600 point range. So let's say a student got a 550 on the math. They could have gotten a 550 by going to the harder module. They could have gotten a 550 by going to that easier module. It does not matter. A 550 is a 550, regardless of which second module that student went to. And also just note, on the PSAT score report that you get back, it has this identical adaptive structure. It's also not going to tell you whether your student was in the harder module or the easier module. On the official score report that you get back from the SAT and send on to college, it's also not going to say whether your student was in the harder module or the easier module. Again, it doesn't matter. A 550 is a 550, regardless of which second module that student's in. But this is how the SAT was able to reduce the length of their test. They were able to go from, again, that 3-hour paper and pencil test to this 2-hour and 15-minute test because of this adaptive scoring format. Okay, so let's talk about the ACT. Again, already mentioned this, but colleges do accept both these tests equally. They do not have a preference for one or the other. So many students will try a practice ACT with us and decide that the ACT is actually the better test for them and go down an ACT path, which is totally fine for them. It's not going to hurt their application process in any way, shape, or form. But the ACT, it's still very much a paper and pencil test. Students can take the ACT online as well. But generally speaking, we recommend that students take it paper and pencil. It's just a little bit of a better testing experience for students to do it in that format. The ACT, they've also not gone to this adaptive scoring structure. It's more of what we call a linear test, where all the questions are worth the same and there's no shift or in difficulty between different modules and things like that. It's very much just, as we say, kind of a little bit more straightforward in that way, linear type of test. But the ACT, if you're not familiar with it, it's divided up into 4 sections. There's an English section, that's the grammar portion of the test. Then there's a math section, then there's a reading section. Then there's this science section. Don't get thrown off by the term science. It's not like what's the chemical formula of photosynthesis. It's more of a scavenger hunt than anything, where students are given scientific passages. They might not know anything about it. And really what they're asked to do is, in the time that they're given, Can they find the information that they need in those passages in order to be able to answer those questions? And Jed mentioned this already, but they are in a market share battle between the ACT and the SAT. The ACT is very interested in trying to regain some of the market share that they lost to the SAT. So in their changes to their test, again, they didn't go to a shorter adaptive test. What they did is they just shortened their test. So if you look at a previous iteration of the ACT, just the longer sections with more questions. And then the other major change that they made is the science section is now optional. Our general advice right now, if your student ends up going down the ACT path, is to take the ACT science at least once. That way you have a science score if you need it. We're still trying to collect a little bit more data. This is kind of a recent change that the ACT made in terms of getting a better sense of if schools are still really looking for those optional science scores. There are some schools out there that are looking for it. There are still some like engineering programs that might want it. For STEM majors, they might want to have a science score to be able to show to colleges. So that's kind of where that recommendation comes from. It's more of a hedge than anything, just kind of not knowing exactly maybe what your college list might look like. We encourage you to take it, if you go down the ACT path, to take it with the science at least once. That way you have a science score if you need it. If you're not familiar with the scoring of the ACT, it takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's on a 1 through 36 scale. So what colleges will see is they'll see the English score, the math score, the reading score, the optional science score if you take the ACT with science. So they'll see those subsection scores. And then they'll also see a overall composite score. And that overall composite score, with science being optional, that overall composite score is just the average of the English, math, and reading scores. But really, one of the main differences between the ACT and the SAT, in addition to not having this adaptive format, is the ACT it's very much a speed test. The difficulty of the ACT comes from the pace of it. It's almost a total sprint from start to finish on that test. Whereas the SAT, we think of the SAT as being more of what we call a power test, just a little bit harder reading on the SAT, just some trickier questions on the SAT, just more misdirection, trying to make things seem harder than they actually are. Whereas the ACT, the reading's a little bit more straightforward and the questions are a little bit more straightforward. But again, the difficulty is the speed of it. Can students actually get through the test in that time allotted? But again, colleges accept both the SAT and ACT equally, so it's really up to your student to decide if they want to go down an SAT path or do they want to go down an ACT path. So here's a quick side-by-side comparison of the two tests. Again, we've already gone through this, but SAT has that digital adaptive format where the ACT does not, more of a still a linear test. With the science being optional, they're pretty comparable in terms of length of time of taking it. A little bit more time per question on the SAT being a power test compared to that speed of the ACT. And then SAT, just shorter passages that require a little bit more analysis, whereas ACT, much longer passages. Can students actually get through it in the time allotted? And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. SAT, it does teach kind of test science. Those science topics are integrated throughout the test. You'll find them in math questions. You'll find them in reading passages as well, whereas that separate ACT passage. And again, this is very, very high level, but generally students who like to get kind of into the weeds on things, try to get into the test taker's head and figure out what a question is asking, generally kind of like the SAT, where the students who are just like, Drew, I really don't want to try to figure out what that math question is actually asking me. I just want to be able to show that I know how to do that type of math problem and work quickly and accurately through it. Generally speaking, a student with that kind of mentality might have a slightly easier time or prefer the ACT. So when I talk about speed versus power, so the power of the SAT versus the speed of that ACT, this is what I mean by that. Just to give you a feel for it, I'm just choosing just an example from an SAT reading and writing passage. So this is just a sample passage from an SAT test. But the other major change that the SAT made when it went to this digital adaptive format is it redefined what a passage is. So a passage on the SAT is no longer like these long essays that students need to fight their way through. They're much shorter now, generally a paragraph or two. But again, being a power test, just because it's shorter doesn't mean the reading is easier.
Wait,
Here's an,
Drew,
yeah.
your volume seemed to have really dropped. I don't know if it's me. You just
Let's
got a
see.
lot quieter.
Can you hear me?
I can. Maybe keep going. It could be mine. Here. Okay.
Hold on. How about now?
You know what? It's my computer. I think you're okay. I must have changed something. You're totally fine.
Oh, okay. No worries. I can hear you fine though, Jed.
Okay.
So you're good. But yeah, on the SAT, one of the major changes they made to the verbal section is they redefined what a passage is. So a passage is no longer like these long essays that students need to work their way through. Much shorter, generally a paragraph or two. But again, just because the passage got shorter, it doesn't mean that it got easier. Still requires a close reading, a deep reading, and analytical reading of that passage. And again, here's an excerpt from a 19th century British novel that students need to fight their way through. And then this one, so here's just, and then the other change that they made is there's only one question per passage. This is what it looks like on the ACT. Passages are much, much longer. Just to give you a sense of this, this is about a third of what the actual passage looks like. The entire passage just wouldn't fit on the slide. And just to give you a sense of the pace of this, just there's 4 passages. There's 9 questions per passage, so 36 questions in total. And students only have 40 minutes to get through this. But because of the fast-paced nature of it, questions more along these lines. The passage points to this. In that limited amount of time, can students show that they read and understood the passage, understood that central argument that author was trying to make? It just doesn't require that deep reading, close reading, analytical reading that SAT passage is going to require. So in terms of which test might be better for your student, really the best way to make this decision is to try both tests, ideally in a practice setting. And definitely feel free to reach out to us at Summit or reach out to us at Applerouth. We provide free practice tests. And it's a great way for students to get a baseline score, but also more importantly, try to choose a path. Am I going SAT or am I going ACT? Roughly 70 to 80% of students score equally well on both tests. But when students have tried both tests, again, ideally in that practice setting, even when those scores come back comparable, oftentimes students have a strong preference to be like, yeah, I feel like the ACT is the better test for me, or maybe the SAT is the better test for them. So that's generally our recommendation is to reach out to us, have students try both, and then we can make it an informed decision as to whether we're going to go SAT or whether we're going to go ACT. Okay, so in terms of just kind of timeline, in terms of mapping out a plan for your student, generally speaking, for sophomore years, it's just kind of learning about the tests a little bit, just trying to, just in some ways, put standardized testing on their radar a little bit. For some schools, they will offer a PSAT. Often it's in the spring of their sophomore year. Again, it really is just for practice to give some students some more experience taking standardized tests. And then end of sophomore year or over the summer before students start junior year, that's a great time. Reach out to us, try a full-length practice SAT, try a full-length practice ACT. Again, we get a baseline score, but most importantly, it helps us choose a path, SAT or ACT, and then also it just gives students a little bit more experience with these tests and helps to highlight kind of their strengths and weaknesses. Generally speaking, most students are going to start implementing their plan kind of junior year. So going into junior year, at the start of junior year, we want to try to choose, are we going SAT or ACT? Students are taking their first official one, and then making sure they start early enough that they have time to take a second one if needed, and then they still have fall of senior year for any additional testing if they just feel like their scores aren't exactly where they want it to be. Generally speaking, most students aren't one and done on these tests just because the first time they take it, they're always a little bit nervous, but most students are going to peak on these after taking it 2 or 3 times, possibly even a 4th time, depending on when they started. But generally speaking, we don't want students taking these things like 7, 8, 9 times, right? They have better things to do with their time. And everyone's standardized testing plan is going to be customized for them. So do not worry if your testing plan ends up looking a little bit different than what a best friend is doing or what a neighbor is doing or possibly even what an older sibling ended up doing. There's many paths to success here. So it's really what's going to work best for your student. So again, first step is reach out to us. Try a practice SAT, try a practice ACT. Again, we get baseline scores, but then we can choose a path. And then in terms of creating that study plan, generally speaking, depending on your student's starting score and their ultimate goal score, most students are kind of looking at about 2 to 3 months of concentrated prep going into that first test. Knowing that students aren't going to be one and done, we also want to build in some time for students just to review a little bit, get themselves back up to speed when they go to take that test a second time or even possibly a third time. But it is important for students to practice. We don't want students going into this cold. And it's kind of three parts. So one is content, just knowing what's all in the test. The other is strategy, just giving the students a game plan and an approach for every section and every question that they're going to see. And then practice, practice, practice. Just taking full length practice tests is a great way to kind of get student stamina down and also get their just get them more familiar with the type of questions that they're gonna see. All right, so just some common mistakes that we see. You know, yes, junior year is challenging, and we know a lot is going on then, but we do want to start on the earlier side if we can. We don't want to be in late spring of junior year and suddenly, feel like, oh my gosh, like I'm running out of time on this. Because the mentality that I want students to have when they go to take a test is just, I always want them to have another test, right? So if they're going into a December SAT, I know they have March. If they're going to March, I know they have May or June. And then going into June, I know they have fall of senior year, for instance, on that SAT. It doesn't mean they're taking every one of those tests, but again, just to take a little bit of pressure off of students. And it's not just content mastery, it's also taking full length practice tests, again, to help students get their pacing down and their approach down. And again, it's really giving students time and making sure they feel confident going into that test and then knowing they have another opportunity to take it again. All right, Jed, I'll kick it over to you.
Thank you, Drew. And I realize I think it's my speaker. I have like the Creative Labs, like the computer speakers. I've had them for at least 10 years. There's a thin coat of dust on both of them. And I think my right one is starting to die. I'm like, is my hearing okay? Like, oh,
No,
that's
it's
my
all good.
speaker. But okay, so question is, why do scores still matter? Why are they coming back like they are? Let's dive into it. All right, first up, this was the big research out of Harvard and the Opportunity Insights group that's led by future Nobel laureate Raj Chetty and his group. One of the big data, super big data analysts. They analyzed 1.5 million applications to these Ivy plus 4 schools, Ivies plus Stanford, MIT, Duke, and Chicago. And what they found is for schools that are very selective, like the Ivies plus 4, looking at their test scores of the applicants as they go from 1,200 to a perfect score, the GPA in college is a straight line, strong correlation. However, look at their high school grades. The difference between kids having a 3.1 GPA in high school and a 4.0 is a difference in college of having a 3.45 in college versus having a 3.52. It's a very weak correlation. And they found that with all the grade inflation taking place, there's not much differentiation between the kids with the highest grades and a little bit lower, even with B average kids. So grades really are not that predictive of performance. It used to be there was less grade inflation, less grade compression. There are kids with C averages and B averages, A averages. Now most kids are getting A averages. And so we're losing some of that strength of prediction from the GPA. So they're saying high school grades aren't that helpful. And that's what they found also at the University of California when they ran their data, that high school GPA was a weaker predictor than test scores. And this is driving a lot of the changes because now they're looking to say, hey, you know what? Looking at our data, test scores are really helping us pick a better class. And the kids with lower test scores are often doing a lot worse in college. Next slide. So grades in the past 30 years, they've been moving up from a 2.7 up to a 3.4, and they keep, COVID really popped them even more than this. And then we're seeing that the average on the left scale, the left axis, the ACT scores, it was a 20.8, 20.9, and now it's down to a 19.5. So test scores are in fact falling, which they really haven't changed what they're measuring as grades keep rising and rising and rising. So kids aren't getting smarter, but grades are going up. So they're not showing that, globally everyone knows a lot more. It's just the grading cultures are shifted. It's all game theory. Everyone knows if we give B's and our neighboring school is giving A's, our kids suffer. So then suddenly, prisoner's dilemma, everyone starts getting A's. And then boom, the grades become less meaningful. And that's where we are as a country, which is part of the problem, why test scores are coming back and AP exams are more important than they used to be, IBs, and so forth. So the universities, here we have 6 quotes, and you can go some of these. At UT Austin, that's one of the big ones. And they went back as required because they found that the kids, the middle of freshman year, the kids who didn't send test scores had 0.86 lower GPA. So kids with test scores, they were at a 3.5. Kids who didn't send test scores, they were at a 2.64. And they were much more likely to be on probation academically. So they're like, forget it, everyone's test required. And after UT, then Ohio State went. Like we're seeing the big flagships with these big populations, which are very different than the elite privates. But the elite privates, MIT and all the STEM schools following and saying, hey, that math score is protective. And kids, below a 700 are failing at MIT. We need testing, optional, no more. And the same thing we're seeing at Caltech and at Carnegie Mellon. They're all saying that math score is critical for our engineers and our STEM kids. And then at Emory, they're currently test optional, but John Ladding said, we don't trust the GPA these days, that grades are definitely inflated. Therefore, external measures count more. This is at Emory, they're optional. And then Brown and Dartmouth and Yale, they all said the same thing. Bruce, Christina, and Jeremiah said test scores are the best predictor of performance, more than high school grades. So this is the rationale for why we're seeing it and why there's more coming. So every couple of months, we're going to see more schools jumping in. And if UC goes, I expect 10, 20 schools will just flood on in. All right, come on. Next slide, please. So strong scores, how can they help? First, they're going to help you submit a stronger application. They demonstrate that you're ready for the high level work, and they show validation, confirmation of abilities and skills and foundations. And so they're extremely important also for the STEM kids. Because again, that math score is critical. If you can't do algebra and you can't do Alg 2, then differential equations, variable, you have to have these foundations to go to advance to the higher level math. And so if you're struggling with algebra, you're going to go into calculus and you're going to really flounder. So that's why these simple 8th, 9th, 10th grade math skills, if they're weak, it's a predictor that kids will have a hard time once they get to high level math. All right, next slide. And here we have some data which is getting older with every passing year. But there was a minute in time when this was all brand new, when test optional was like, oh, wow, this is new. And these colleges were being very transparent. The black box opened up and they're like, well, we're admitting kids with test scores at this rate and kids without scores at this rate. And after 2024, they locked all this up because they have no incentive to share this information. And it creates it discourages kids with lower scores to apply. And they want everyone to apply. And so they aren't sharing this data. But for that 1 year or two of transparency, we saw that the admissions rate for kids with test scores was at many schools 2-to-1, but not at every school. At Boston College, and they've now changed their guidance to recommended to just, as optional. In Colgate, they're 2-to-1, Notre Dame, Emory. But then there are schools like Tufts and Fordham where the difference wasn't that strong. So there were definitely, but now Vandy's now test required. But so they still found some benefit once they ran their data. But I think, testing matters a lot more. Like Yale, they were totally optional and said there's no difference. But then on a podcast, Jeremiah Quinlan said, we're letting in kids with test scores at a rate of 3x. And so we felt we weren't being honest with kids. And they went back to test required. So again, there's a challenge here for parents trying to figure out what admissions officers care about because you don't really know. They don't give clear signals because they don't want to discourage anyone from applying. But on the back, when you actually see their data, it's like, wow, some of these top schools really like test scores. And that's part of the challenge of not reading their websites, not knowing what's actually happening on the back end. All right, next slide, please. And then test scores can help you with a better application and cash. There are many schools in the country, Alabama, Ole Miss, Carolinas, and my niece, she had a 1390 on the SAT, and after some prep, and she ended up getting in-state tuition at USC and graduated in May. And so it was, and also Tulane offered her some money. She got Georgia. The having a strong test score, and she's from Virginia, from Richmond. Strong test scores can definitely make a difference at certain schools. The Ivies, no, they don't give merit-based aid, but there are many schools in the country, and I often quote Alabama because Alabama gives these tremendous scholarships. She got a 1390. They offered her tuition would have gone from here it is, Alabama, and this is current for this year. And so 1390 tuition went from it was like 30, now it's like 35 grand down to about 10 grand. And so it was going to be a net savings over the course of 4 years of $96,000. And for her family, that's very, very meaningful. And so this is where certain schools, often state schools a little bit lower than the Ivies, the Ivy adjacent, where they do offer money for great grades and great test scores. So it can affect the price of college. All right, next slide. All right, now the path forward. That's Drew. I'm hand it over to you. Or yeah.
Yeah, so it's really, I mean, it's kind of back to that testing plan that we talked about, that first step trying to decide, am I going SAT or am I going ACT? And then it's really in terms of that testing strategy, the question we often get around this is, what's a quote good score? And as you'll hear often in college admissions, the answer that you get, which is always not satisfying at all, is it depends. So, in terms of the scores that you'll ultimately want or you'll ultimately be striving for, a lot's going to depend on terms of where your student's starting, right? Because the goal of prep is not to get a perfect score. We're not doing endless prep. We're not doing endless testing to get that perfect score. We're trying to get a score that's more in line with what that student's capable of academically and what they're doing day in and day out in school. And different schools are going to have very, very different score ranges in terms of what they're looking for from their applicants. And I will say, if you Google this, schools are pretty good about reporting this data. They will report their average SAT or ACT scores. So as you're thinking about your students list, it will give you a feel, at least in terms of kind of where that score might need to ultimately come in for that particular school. And that's generally going to dictate kind of what your goal is, because applying to Harvard with a standardized testing score is going to be very, very different than maybe applying to a smaller, liberal arts college like a Kenyon or something. Not that they're not competitive, they're still very competitive. But in terms of the types of scores that they're looking for, it's gonna cover a range. Again, we already talked about this. We want to try to choose a path, choose the SAT or ACT. We're trying to make this as efficient as possible. We don't want to try to prep for both. Like, why prep for both when you can just prep for one? We want to start early enough, right? So there's always kind of another potential test that students can take just to take some of that pressure off and take some of that stress away. So you want to make sure you leave time for a retake. Just no one can perform under that kind of pressure. Like going in a fall of senior year and being like, okay, my early decision deadline is November 1, so I'm going to take the October SAT and I'm ready and here we go, right? No one can perform under that. And then we see statistically, most students are going to peak on this after taking it twice, maybe a third time in that fall of senior year as needed. And then just as you're thinking about standardized testing, again, we encourage students to keep standardized testing on their radar. There's always exceptions to this. But as Jed was mentioning, for many, many of the schools that might ultimately end up on your students list, having a strong test score can be very helpful in this process. But it is good knowing in terms of, is the school test required, right? Are they test optional? It is good knowing in terms of what your students' policies are, because for the test optional schools, your students in control of their scores. So they decide whether they're going to ultimately send that score or not. Obviously, if they're applying to a test required school, school, they obviously have to submit that score. But it is useful to know what the different policies of the schools are that are on your list, because as Jed mentioned, there is a range of policies. There is a range of, even in those test optional schools, are they leaning into testing? How much emphasis are they putting on those scores? Jed, anything to add on this one?
No, no, that's great. And and part of it is there is a nuance. Like when Penn went test required, they said part of the reason it went back is because of the stress it causes families. And I've seen my friend and his daughter with that 33, and we talked to several admissions officers, former Vandy officers, and like, do we send the 30 or like 34 or bust? And the answer we came up with, talking to several former Vandy admissions officers is don't send the 33, send the 34 only. And that kind of nuance is nuts where it really creates some, but find out, talk to your counselor, your school counselors, get info, but in the same score, that 33 will be fine at Wash U for 81 or 82, fine at Tulane, but not fine for Vanderbilt. So it's like the same score will help you here and hurt you here. And so you have to understand like the score ranges, that middle 50. And there was a question actually in the Q&A. I hear it can be a disadvantage to submit if your scores are too low. Yes, it can. And this is an example where that 33, like their range now at Vandy, only half the kids, roughly 55% of kids or so, submit test scores, and the other 46% don't submit test scores. So at Vandy, like only half the kids submit, but and their range went up pre-pandemic. Vandy's range was a 33 to 35, but then post-pandemic, it's a 34 to 30. So it's a smaller range and even tighter on the SAT. But what they're saying is we like this nice tight range. So we don't want scores that might pollute it or muddy it or bring it down. So only send scores that help us and look good, and don't send scores that lower it. Same with Tulane. Tulane told my niece, her 1390, we only want a 1420 or above. And don't send anything below that 1420. And she didn't, and she got in. And so ultimately, listen to the admissions officers, listen to your, if they gave those things, the secrets, listen to your counselors. But again, be mindful that, that whatever score you get, may help you here, hurt you here. Therefore, you treat each school differently. That's really critical. All right.
Yeah, and also like Tufts has gone the other way. So Tufts,
yeah,
because they went test optional, their average scores, not going to surprise anybody, went up because it's obviously the students with the higher scores that were sending scores. But even though Tufts is test optional, if you go to their website and you look under their policies, from their admission officer, they're like literally saying like, look, we know our average score is like 1420 to 1500, but if you have a 1300, please send us that SAT score. We want to see that score. And I think it's to Jed's, point earlier with the whole grade inflation and kids just coming prepared to be able to handle some of the challenges of college. Tufts was like, we know students who hit a 1300. They do well at our school. We want to see that score. So please, in some ways, ignore our published data, because there is some misconception out there that like it's got to be like 1400 or bust on the SAT. I've heard like 1500 or bust, or like 30, nothing lower than a 34. And I feel like schools, even with high published averages, are kind of coming off of that. Because again, if you have a score of 1350, like there's some good skills behind that score, and there are many schools out there that I think would love to see that 1350 now. But again, as Jed mentioned, there is some nuance to this. Definitely reach out to your college counselor and things in terms of, whether to submit or not, because it's not always quite as, straightforward as it might initially seem.
And it might be helpful for your high school if you have SCORE, SCOIR, and there's scattergrams, seeing where are the green marks, where the kids got in with certain scores, GPA, where they were waitlisted, where they were turned down. That can help. Oh, the tiny poll, if it can help you, with any of this, we do test preparation, Summit in Applerouth. We do, we help kids with these tests for, we've helped tens of thousands of kids. We do coaching for executive functioning training. If you want us to reach out to you, please let us know. We're happy to help you with these academics challenges and more.
And of course, you can reach out to us at any time as well. But feel free if you want us to reach out to you directly to fill out the poll. Let's see. Other questions?
More questions. We have 4 more questions.
Here's a good one. So if science portion is taken on the ACT, is that calculated in the composite score or just a separate score on the report? Because it's optional, it is not factored into the composite score. It is just a standalone score. So the composite score on the ACT is just going to be the average of the English, math, and reading sections. If you take the science, colleges can still see that score if they're interested in it, but it is just a standalone score. It is not factored or averaged in as part of that composite score.
Yeah. There's one comment in terms of analysis that, like, Texas said, hey, first year, middle of first year, kids with testing were this much better. How about second, third, fourth year? And these schools do their research, they run their analysis, they run their regression on freshman GPA, four-year GPA, graduation rates, four-year, six-year, and they find that the majority of schools are finding that this actually is predictive for freshman performance, but also senior and graduation rates and so forth. So it's more than just freshman year for many of these schools who run their own internal data. All right, taking it both, Drew?
Yeah, here's a great question. Thank you for asking this. So, will taking both affect a student and how a college looks at those scores? Um, you do not get extra credit for submitting both scores. You do not need to take both tests. You do not need to submit two scores. I would say, generally speaking, students we work with, I'd say roughly about 90% of students kind of pick their test. We have reasons as to why we went in that direction. They devote their time and energy into preparing for that test and ultimately hit their goal score with that test. Roughly, I'd say about 10% of students, just for whatever reason, they feel like they've maxed out on that on either an SAT or an ACT, and maybe just want to try the other test to see if they can maybe pick up some more points or kind of get a score that they feel is more up to their potential. But generally, even for those students who take both, you'll send the higher score. So there is a concordance table between the two tests, so you can compare an SAT score to an ACT score. It's the same concordance table that all colleges use, which is why they accept both tests equally, because they can easily compare those scores. So if a student goes down the SAT path, totally hits their goal score, feels good about that score, they are absolutely done. There is no need to prepare for or take an ACT. Colleges are not looking for both scores. It doesn't help a student in any way, shape, or form. Hopefully that addresses that.
All right, there's one question. So in terms of how optional is optional, when you have a school with very similar middle 50 percentiles, one school, the enrolled students have a 70% test submission rate, and one school is 30. Clearly, the school that's admitting 7 of 10 kids without test scores, tests are not as, I think about UConn. UConn, it's in the 20s. So strong testing, they're admitting 3/4 of their class without test scores. So I say don't sweat it so much. When you have a school that admits over 60% of students with test scores, I say that's more indicative that testing is a bigger factor at the school. It's more important. And once you get over 70%, now it's like, tests are really meaningful. So I think that percentile of enrolled students with testing, that's on a common data set, it's a C9. That is, I think, quite important, getting a sense of the admissions office's philosophy and how important tests actually are.
Yeah, we talk about it in terms of, yes, both schools are test optional, but one school seems to be leaning into testing much more
Yeah.
heavily than the other one. But as Jed mentioned, if you just Google common data set for a college that you're interested in, when you pull up that report, one section is called C9, but you can see the percent of enrolled students that submitted an SAT score or an ACT score, and that will give you an idea in terms of, yes, they're test optional, but how much are they truly kind of leaning into that score?
There was one question, do we have a list of schools, like for a STEM applicant, you're applying to be an engineer, and a list of schools where the math is critical, but they weigh the verbal less. Don't have a list like that. I think typically anything that's one of the reasons why many of these schools don't have test required. They really wanted that math score. But typically, if you're an engineer, or if you're going to be computer science, or if you're going to be physics or math, most STEM majors, non-health, they do want to see some strong quantitative skills. And so the math really is critical. But in terms of how much weight they put on the verbal, they don't really release that. You can probably ask around, talk to them, admissions officer, email. But there's no list that we keep like that.
Right. And you can also maybe get a sense of it by looking at their published SAT and ACT scores if there's a big discrepancy in terms of kind of where the math average range is versus the verbal range is. That might give you a little bit of an indication, at least in terms of kind of what they're looking for there.
That's our last question, Drew. You can
All
knock it
righty.
out.
Nice. Jed, any closing thoughts here as we wrap up?
No, just the main thing is give this thing time.
Yes.
It's not a rush job. It's not a cram job. This thing takes several months, and the practice tests really make a difference. And going in with a plan. These are the key elements to being successful, and practice tests are really critical. And then putting it in the time of the your relatively lighter season versus like you have 12 year as a junior, it's a pretty intense year, but there are little pockets that are a little bit easier. So put the prep where it's slightly easier, and it's not like your hardest season when you're full on varsity or leading the play. Try to find the places where it's a little bit less stressful to get this work in.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. Thanks everybody for joining tonight. We hope this was helpful. Jed, thank you.
Yeah.
Always great seeing you. And definitely do not hesitate to reach out if you need anything from us. And again, we're going to try to get the link to the recording to you either tomorrow or on Wednesday. But thanks everybody for joining. We hope this was helpful and enjoy the rest of your evening. All right. Take care, everybody.